I'm Dylan Nolan. You're Liam Ford. We last spoke, what, 6 months ago now, I guess, about a week after the events on January 6th. And I spoke to you because you were there, not entering the building. In fact, you left, what, like an hour before that, once things started getting weird over there?
Yeah, um, we left DC pretty quickly as well. We kind of stopped at the hotel and then left because kind of saw the way things were headed and didn't necessarily want to be around for it or caught in the crossfire or however that was going to play out the day of. And then obviously in the months since, turns out to probably have been a very good decision.
Yeah, you haven't had a letter or a knock at the door since then.
Just for the vaccine, not for not for
Right.
my events, not for the events on January 6th.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll all be getting knocks at the door, those of us who are not in the vaccine club yet.
Yeah.
So, of course, I think I said this at the beginning of our last conversation, but there are some things that both of us would probably like to talk about, but that we probably would be ill-advised to talk about, given that this will be going on YouTube, and I enjoy having the ability to post things on YouTube, and they enjoy taking things down, especially if they talk about, like, right now it seems to be alternative treatments for COVID, election integrity, and actually the vaccine itself even.
Yeah. It's a long list of unauthorized opinions. Let's just put it that way. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have the freedom that people seem to think they have.
Yeah, there's a thin veil there where, and I understand, when spend your whole life as a conservative arguing for the ability of companies in the free market to make choices that they want to make, but it is a little scary when you see the lockstep moves of big tech and also the direct links that they seem to have with the executive branch of the federal government as to what they choose to allow and not allow.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even like subtle anymore, is it? I mean, Tacky said like a couple of days ago. A couple of days ago, she says that they are flagging content for Facebook, right? So there's not a veneer, there's not a veil, there's not any pretense anymore that they aren't working together. And of course, I mean, you can look on LinkedIn and there's, dozens of job openings in all of these major companies for, policy consultants or government liaisons or all of these different positions that obviously are working with, state, local, federal governments because they are working together. Like, and there's no denying it anymore. And I think that is a real problem that conservatives have kind of shied away from because of, we're individualistic, our love of the free market, all of that kind of weakened our position on this for too long, especially some of the older generations of conservatives, I think. So it is a problem that is going to have to be dealt with, not just for conservatives, but for, anybody who wants to live in a free country.
And how do you see platforms like, obviously, Parler didn't make it too long, but Gab is still out there, as is Odyssey and Rumble. I don't know if you know, but Trump said he would go on Rumble if they started doing hate speech regulation, which I thought was pretty funny because that's the same path that ended up getting him booted off the rest of the social media platforms.
Yeah, so the Section 230 debate was a lot of talk for about 2 years from the Republicans, and nothing got done, which is obviously problematic because social media is how everybody communicates, how everybody is informed, how everybody gets information, basically how the world works. The world runs through social media essentially now. And the failure to get any reform, any meaningful reform on Section 230 is obviously going to have, negative consequences going forward. And what we didn't necessarily see, although it makes sense if you think about it, is kind of what that inaction means, because you see last week the DNC and Democrats coming out and saying that we need to be that cell phone providers, like reception providers, need to be monitoring text messages, specifically for vaccine disinformation. But obviously, as with everything in government, that will grow pervasively. The list of things that need to be monitored will grow pervasively. So if platforms like Twitter, Facebook are able to control and censor what is said on their legally considered platform, there's no reason that AT&T and Verizon shouldn't be able to keep you from sending text messages with the exact same content that would get you kicked off of Twitter or Facebook. And we set that precedent that they would be able to get away with that whenever we didn't do anything with Twitter or Facebook for the last 2 years. So it's kind of an interesting other side of the coin for conservatives' inability and Republicans' inability to get anything done in Congress on, reforming Section 230. As far as how it's going to actually be taken care of moving forward, I'm not sure that it will. If partly because it's a money game. The amount of money that these corporations control, the amount of power and influence that they have, not only in our society as a whole, but specifically over the politicians who would be called upon to make these regulations, I don't see it happening at a federal level. The best option I see is something to be done at a state level, like what we've seen with DeSantis propose, where, if these social media companies ban or take down content from political officers, then they would be subject to fines per day. It's like $100,000, I think. That might be effective. And it's also something that could be implemented on a statewide level because, the tech companies don't have as much influence in state houses and over governors as they do the federal branches of government. But yeah. I'm not sure that there's anything really going to be done about it.
And you see conservatives complaining all the time about states like California setting what effectively becomes federal legislation, because if you're going to sell cars in America, you're going to sell enough of them in California that you're going to comply with California law. You're not going to make a specific run of cars that you're only going to sell in California. So by setting the emission standards and whatever that they set over there, it becomes what happens across the board. And obviously it's easier to apply different standards in different regions as a technology provider, but at the same time, what are you going to do? Have Florida Facebook and Florida Twitter? No, you're going to have to make the call as to whether you're going to defy Florida for everybody or whether you're going to listen. And that means that even if you're in California where they hate Florida politicians, you're still going to be able to see them on Twitter and Facebook. And I think that you're right as to the inability of our federal legislators to get it done. I look at conservatives on Capitol Hill. It's like, okay, there's the couple hundred members of Congress, but then you have the millions of people who work for the federal government, most of which are on the far opposite side of any of these conservative legislators. And the reality is that all of the rules that we follow, that we consider to be the laws in this country, come from regulatory agencies. The legislators themselves will pass, this really broad law that says, okay, we want the air to be clean. Bam, we make the EPA. And then the EPA decides how to do that. So even if conservative legislators that would not approve of really dramatic EPA regulations vote to make the EPA exist, well, then they've lost as they've ceded power to the people on the far left who work at the EPA who promulgate the regulations. Yeah. So until we have any sort of institutional power within the regulatory agencies, hoping for anything other than liberal policy coming out of those regulatory agencies is pretty hopeless.
Yeah, and this is kind of the problem that I think that the Trump administration ran into really, really quickly, is that you, especially coming from private business, you are used to being able to move at a certain pace, having so much control over what you can control is pretty much everything in private business if you're the top person. But if you're in government and you have, hundreds of thousands of employees just in the Department of Education alone, then for you to get anything done within the education sphere is next to impossible. Even if you spend 4 years of your time working on it and you have one of the, Betsy DeVos who was a good, Secretary of Education, but it didn't matter because you had, as you said, all of these, people that are just in their bureaucratic positions, basically roadblocking every idea and every reform that gets pushed, or proposed. The other issue, and I think it was Tucker Carlson that said this, that Republicans are terrible as a governing party. And it's 100% true. They hate to be in power. And there's a lot of theories I have, and that it's a long, we don't really know why that is. I think we all probably have a few different theories as to why that is. but it's kind of undeniable that it's a fact. They refuse to use power whenever they have it to kind of push things through. So whenever conservatives do have, all three branches of government, they don't really get anything. They don't really do anything. They won't push the envelope. You have a lot of Republicans that will break party lines. Democrats really never break party lines unless they're allowed to, because the majority knows that they're going to pass legislation anyway, and it would help a specific Democrat in their constituency. Republicans don't have that type of unity, and it was a real problem not only with Section 230, but especially during the Trump administration, where you had Paul Ryan, who kind of stepped out after the first 2 years of the Trump administration, really hijacked and sabotaged a lot of the opportunities that could have been, especially for the last 2 years of his presidency. But they're so disjointed. There was no unity in the party. So among the leadership, among the base, it's actually more unified as the Republican Party than the Democrat Party is. But among the leadership, it's the opposite. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy.
And that definitely leads to inefficacy. And I think the other problem is when you are a party that's striving for greater power, it's easy to say, okay, we're at the reins here for 2 years. Let's make the biggest grasp that we can. That's how you make the giant push and get Obamacare through. Whereas when you're the party that's for less governmental power, it's a lot harder to get through. And I mean, what are you going to do? Nuke Obamacare, nuke the EPA? It's all very unrealistic once you're actually standing there in Congress. If you're just a member of Congress, to say this is the stance we're going to take.
Yeah, it's definitely true, because the whole acquisition of power kind of falls in line with continuing to acquire and accumulate more power, which is basically what the Democrats' goal has been for a really long time, whether it's, whatever area of policy we're talking about. But you're right, as conservatives, you're supposed to stand for less government, less authority. And this is kind of a complaint that some Republicans have with DeSantis in Florida, that he's not using executive power to protect the Second Amendment or any of these things. But he was pretty clear that he's not going to use executive power. Everything's going to have to come from the legislature. I think it's the right move, because if you just kind of play by the rules that you hate whenever they're used against you, then you kind of lose the ability to fight against, playing by those rules. But it definitely can be frustrating, and a lot of Republicans don't seem to understand why DeSantis is refusing to use executive power, which really hurts the messaging and the unity of the party. Because if everybody understood why, I think it'd be a lot more popular, and it'd be a lot more respected. But
yeah, there's a lot of Republicans that don't understand the argument of doing things through the legislature, not doing them through the courts, not doing them through executive power. But that's a really bedrock conservative American government principle.
Yes.
But unfortunately, if you're just focused on the ends, you're never going to see that, and you're not going to value it.
Yeah.
So DeSantis has come up a couple times here. You're a guy who worked on the Trump campaign. How do you feel about Ron DeSantis? How do you feel? In my mind, he carries forward a lot of the good things about MAGA and drops a lot of the bad things. He's actually someone with experience in government. And while Trump being an outsider was a great thing, it also meant that when he got there, as you already have pointed out, not a lot got done. I think largely because he had no clue how to operate within a bureaucracy or how to get legislation through. And I think he was manipulated by almost everybody that was around him for their personal agendas. From what I've read of how DeSantis runs his shop in Florida, he keeps a tight rope on his office. He's a pretty tough guy to work for, but at the same time, he actually understands how to get his policy goals through, and he actually has policy goals, whereas Trump had policy goals, but I don't know if they came from a place of principle so much as these are things that I said at a rally that did well, and I just kept saying them, and now I'm in the White House. So I don't know. I'm hopeful about DeSantis. However, I could definitely see Trump running, and obviously he wouldn't put himself in front of the bus that is Donald Trump. although he might get on the bus that is Donald Trump. So where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like Trump is going to run again. Getting out, doing the rallies again.
Totally.
It If I had to guess right now, DeSantis would probably be the number one pick for vice president. It would be if I was Trump, I would definitely pick DeSantis. I think I don't really. I'm not sure it's best if Trump runs again for a plethora of reasons. Another kind of dark horse candidate that I've heard mentioned a few times that I'm definitely interested in would be General Flynn. Obviously problematic with, kind of the way he was forced out from the, 17 days into the Trump administration, but they're still friends. They're still friendly. I think it was Flynn actually that kind of got him out on, the rally trail again to do these rallies. So they're still obviously like working together politically. And I think Flynn, kind of like DeSantis, brings some of the better aspects of the America First movement without some of the baggage that you get with Trump. Obviously, you're still going to have the entire corporate press turned against him, as you will whoever is nominated as a Republican is going to get the same treatment. You just know that Donald Trump is going to get it so much worse than everybody else. As far as DeSantis specifically, I think I'm not sure that he's ready for the presidency. And maybe that's my naivety, or maybe that's my selfishness, because I want him to remain governor, because I know that whatever policies come out of the White House, that we're going to have at least some protection and insulation from that as long as he remains governor. So I definitely don't want to lose him as governor of Florida. I think he would be way better than a lot of the other names that have been thrown around for president. I don't think Kristi Noem should run. I don't believe in Kristi Noem as a leader of the Republican Party, of conservatism. I don't believe that she would stand firm really at all, as evidenced by her handling of the transgenderism issue with the with the high school sports. So we don't really have a lot of options to choose from right now. So DeSantis, as much as I would hate to lose him, would probably be my second choice to run behind Flynn right now. But I think most likely what ends up happening is Trump runs again and probably ends up picking DeSantis as his VP. I'm not sure if DeSantis will say yes to that, because he's been fairly consistent in saying that he wants to stay governor of Florida, and that's what he's focused on.
That's what they all say. Come on now.
I agree, 100% agree. But I'm also not sure that he would give it up for the VP slot.
Trump's pretty old. He eats a lot of McDonald's. He never exercises. This is a good VP slot to have at this point.
Well, it's the second best in history behind what Kamala got. So, although there's a new poll out that 64% of Americans don't think that she's ready to be president. So that's going to be interesting to see moving forward.
Low, considering she fell apart before she even had.
Yeah, I didn't look at the sample size of each party, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was skewed a little bit to make it even more manageable. And evidently, heads of state in Europe are taking bets on cases of wine to see how long Biden will last. I saw that report a couple of days ago. So that's, always reassuring whenever nobody has any faith in the leader of the free world that he can even live out his term. But yeah, I think DeSantis probably is in the running for sure. But I think Trump will probably end up running again.
What do you make of the, I'm sure you were growing up in a conservative environment, and the Republican Party was always the corporate party, and the Democrats were always against that, more of the workers' party, whereas we've seen laborers switch to be conservatives or at least Republicans, and we've seen the Democrats pick up the college-educated corporate crowd. So we've seen a momentous shift here. Do you think that this will outlast Trump, and / do you think that populism being the conservatives' mainstay will be a permanent thing that we see, or do you think we're going to go back to having a reorientation of the Republicans being the corporate party so how do you see that playing out?
It's interesting because it's such a well adopted political norm, right? That this is the way like the switch is so revolutionary. I'm not 100% sure that it's accurate. If you look at small business owners, for example, these people have always, been conservative, right? So you got what you really see from what I have, read and understood about it is that you had union workers that would tend to vote Democrat, and private business owners, small business owners, et cetera, would lean conservative. So whenever people talk about like the blue collar people, they're really only talking about, factory workers that were in unions, et cetera. Obviously, that industry got really decimated with the North American Free Trade Agreement under Bill Clinton. Net loss of, I think, like 700,000 jobs. And so I think it probably started then that people realized that it's not necessarily Republican and Democrat. There's an establishment that incorporates both parties, and this has been pretty well documented with throughout our involvement in the Middle East and the Middle Eastern wars, how John McCain and Hillary Clinton worked together. People that were seen as political enemies were really not adversaries. They would put on a show. They would talk bad about each other in the press, but they really had the same goals and they had the same objectives. So I think what really happened is that people kind of saw that it wasn't Republican versus Democrat, but it was kind of one party. And then upon that realization, you kind of had the populist conservative movement that kind of grew up outside of the mainstream establishment Republicans. So it was almost like a third party got created because the people realized that the two parties that they had grown up, believing in, associating themselves with, were not really the two parties that they were told existed. I think populism within the conservative movement is probably going to last for a good bit, if only because, as you mentioned, the Democrats kind of have this monopoly right now on academia, on really all of the institutions in the country, but in particular in academia. And so everybody that, goes to college is kind of inoculated with the same beliefs. I personally have had no conservative professors. I'm going into my fourth year at a university, and I've had absolutely zero conservative professors. And the studies are there that in the social sciences, especially, study like sociology, you're going to have a breakdown of like 37-1 liberal to conservative professors. So whenever people go to universities, they're definitely not getting, exposed to a wide range of political beliefs. They're not being challenged. What's happening is they're really being indoctrinated, and that's really what's happening. There's not really another word for it, because whenever that's all you're exposed to, and especially with the verbiage that is used within college classrooms, especially in the liberal arts fields nowadays, the way people are, they lambast Trump, they lambast Trump supporters. It's Republicans are construed as racists, and there's not any middle ground. There's not any chance that what you're told is wrong, right? So I don't see any way that conservatism right now moving forward can survive in any other medium outside of populism. So it's kind of a last chance, last ditch effort at survival, that conservatism has to adopt a populist bent. And it's also that I think that there's no way that the conservative movement loses its that the liberal movement loses its grip on the institutions, and that'll prevent Republicans from being the quote unquote corporate party again. But it's also something that if you look at Nancy Pelosi, for example, look at how her net worth has ballooned from 2000 to now. she's now worth $150 million. And a lot of that has to do with, how her husband has made has made, stock deals and stock options and all of that for, 15 years. Her husband bought, options in Tesla a week before Biden announced that, he was going to move the entire federal vehicle fleet to electric vehicles. Obviously, Tesla is going to have a huge chance at that contract. And we see this kind of like repeated. So the idea that the Democrats have been the party of the small guy is kind of antiquated, not only because, the people at the top of the Democrat Party have been in power for so long, but they've done nothing to help the people who have been at the bottom, but also because the people at the top have enriched themselves for so long off of the people that they keep down at the bottom. And that's a large reason why you see, such a large push to bring in a new voter base across the southern border, is because the Democrats, they need to have a voter base that they're able to always make sure that there's somebody that they can assert as the victim in a situation. And this has been the game of the Democrats, and it's been the game of BLM, and it's been the game that's been played for every 4-year election cycle. And without getting, close to anything that will get the video taken off of YouTube, it's problematic that the party that claims it supports the small guy is the party that needs the small guy to be kept down in order to stay in political power. That's a conflict that nobody's really addressed, and that nobody seems to really realize with the way the Democratic Party has operated for the last 40 or 50 years.
I think probably the most interesting thing that you said in that whole segment there was the realization that people had that, Hillary Clinton and John McCain were friends. Mm-hmm. And that extends throughout almost all the elected officials that you would recognize from inside the Beltway. I was listening to Hillary Clinton's interview on Howard Stern, which is very, very good. If you haven't listened to that, I would highly recommend that, because it's the first time that she's ever seemed like a human being, because of course at this point she's lost the election, so she feels like she can talk freely, which I'm listening to this thinking like, why did you not just do this when you were campaigning? Because she always
when was this
so fake. I don't know, sometime in the last 4 years, obviously, but I think it was closer to the election than to now, because they weren't talking re-election at all. It wasn't a super political talk. Like, she talked about meeting Bill. Now, of course, it's not like 90s Howard Stern, because he would have asked her how she felt when she learned about Monica Lewinsky and the dress and everything. It's post 2010 Howard Stern, where he asks fluffy, nice questions. Mm-hmm. But he's also a Hillary Clinton fangirl. But she was talking about how absolutely shocked she was when Donald Trump came out there and was actually mean to her, because she'd gotten so accustomed to the Beltway rules where, you write your op-ed in the New York Times about how you don't like Hillary Clinton, and then you guys are like very cordial on the elevator and go, ha, 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 ha. Yes, of course, I had to say that about you. But it's the Republican and the conservative movement was completely ready for somebody to say, well, do you actually really not like these policies and the people who promulgate them? Then act like it, which is what allowed Trump's ascendancy. I get the sense that there are so many of these conservatives waiting in the wings for the time when they can not be politically punished for going back to the old ways. Which, as somebody who's not very enthusiastic about a Trump 24 run, I see his many flaws. I think that would be one of the only good things, is that it would just give him more years of holding a vice grip on the parties, so that more of these people age out and get replaced with MAGA-minded people, because I see there's a huge desire among all these politicians who lived this way for decades and who viewed the last 4 years as a complete aberration, and who just want to go back to, the managed decline of the status quo.
Exactly.
I see that as the thing that's constantly simmering within the GOP right now, as far as people who want to return to status quo and people who actually want to agitate change.
Yeah, and I mean, you saw this with Paul Ryan, and the way he exited in 2018. And yeah, I 100% agree that that people, it's bread and circuses, right? That, you know, we were put on a show that, you know, the American people bought for however many decades. And you're right that Trump kind of took advantage of an understanding that a lot of people had. I think a lot of people knew, especially on the right, obviously, that it was a game, that they were being played, that, you know, McCain and Hillary and, you know, anybody that you could name, you know, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, they're all friends, right? Regardless of the R or the D by their name, they're all friends. They're all playing for the same team, and that team is themselves. They don't really care about America. They don't care about their constituents, any of that. And so a lot of people blame Trump for, you know, how harsh he was. I don't think that's necessarily fair, because the fact is that before Trump came along, the American people were being shafted right, left, and center by every political candidate that got sent to Washington, basically. There were a couple that would stand up and make great speeches, but they were so few in number that they had no actual power. They had no actual, they couldn't affect any change. So it was really useless. And Trump realized that, and Trump was the first person that was able to really capitalize on the anger and the frustration that the American people had with the complete ineptitude of the federal government. So I don't really blame him for, you know, destroying the good old days of political cordiality.
No, the good old days weren't that good for the American people. They were good for the political class, which is why they absolutely lost their minds when he came into power.
Yes, and I don't necessarily think that, you know, it's virtuous to be nice to somebody that you're cooperating with behind the scenes to sell your people out. Like that does not make you a more virtuous person, but that's kind of been the claim for the last 4 years, that, you know, Trump was this blight on American democracy, and you know, he was an embarrassment on the international stage, and I don't think really any of that's true. I think rather everybody who is anybody in DC got upset because their gravy train had been interrupted, and because they had to worry about defending themselves from somebody who at any moment could expose them. And this goes back to kind of the Republican, like the playbook for Republican politicians has don't attack first. Always, you know, only attack if you get punched first, right? And Trump wasn't like that. Trump said, you know what, I'm going to go out and preemptively attack this person because he knows that he can score political points doing it. And there's no reason that Republicans shouldn't do that, because the fact is that Democrats have been striking Republicans, you know, for, you know, political purposes for 15, 20 years up, you know, before Trump came around. So Trump wasn't doing anything new. He was just basically giving the Democrats a taste of their own medicine, which didn't go over well. So whenever people don't realize that, all that it means is they didn't really understand what the situation and what the agreement was behind the scenes between the two parties, and between especially the higher ups of the two parties before Trump came around, because they're all friends. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the picture of, you know, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama at the baseball game. You know, they're all together, they're all smiling, they're all friends, they're all having fun. Right? And that's what it is. They're all getting rich while they sell America down the drain, as you said, a controlled decline.
Yeah, and this kind of brings me back to January 6th and how conservatives have reacted to it, because the way that the liberal media has reacted to it is exactly what you'd expect. I mean, it's a slam dunk. Obviously, you just Trump's bad, Trump supporters are bad, look what they've done, and you show the clips over and over. And the reality is it's terrible. I mean, the party of Back the Blue, like dragging cops through a crowd and hitting them with blunt objects and beating them with flags and bear spraying them. It's a terrible thing. And obviously, I would expect the liberal media to capitalize on that, because what the hell are they doing if they don't capitalize on that? I mean, that's like the easiest to score points that have ever existed in you know, modern political media. What's been very interesting to me is how the conservative commentariat has reacted to January 6th. And I think it speaks to a lot of the same bifurcation in desires within the conservative movement right now. To one, you don't want to step on Trump's toes and have him nuke you as, you don't want to get Liz Cheney. You don't want to be the next person to do that. You've seen a lot of the members of Congress who voted to certify the election results when Trump put the screws to him have basically bowed to him, even though on that instance they weren't for him. You've seen the ones that have not done that have Trump show up to their district and campaign for primary opponents. So on the one hand, there's the desire to not speak out about January 6th because that's going to get Trump to come after you. But on the other hand, there's conservative speakers, whatever, commentariat folks who really downplay the significance of the day in my mind, and how much it was a disenfranchised American people, a group of these people, very large group. Some of this was clearly planned by groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, weeks in advance, but hundreds of those people were just people who were along for the ride, who feel disenfranchised. And the fact of the matter is that 60% of the US people, and this is being generous, don't approve of the job that Congress is doing. And to me, the conservative response, if there was some nuance, would be the actions of January 6th were absolutely horrible. We completely denounce them. This must never happen again. However, this happened because there are tens of millions of people within this country that feel completely disenfranchised by the political system, and we're here to speak for them. Instead, the response seems to have been, January 6th, you call it a deadly insurrection. The only person who died was Ashley Babbitt. January 6th, you say it was an insurrection. Well, they didn't actually technically take over the functions of government, so it wasn't really an insurrection. It's like, don't downplay that event. Don't downplay the seriousness of it just because it makes you look bad. Accept the heat, because you're going to take the heat either way, and then say, now let's talk about why the hell this happened, because that did not happen by accident.
Mm-hmm. So this is probably the most complicated political situation in recent American history, at least in my memory.
Certainly.
And part of the problem is that we get no airtime, even in conservative media, about what really happened on that day. We're still waiting on 14,000 hours of security footage from inside the building, which is absolutely absurd. And some of the district court judges are starting to really get on the DOJ about that, because they're holding people in solitary confinement still on charges that would not get solitary confinement as a punishment if they are found guilty of them, but to hold them in solitary confinement in pre-trial for unlawful picketing on government property, parading, interrupting a government hearing is absurd. Like, I cannot possibly overstate how wrong and absurd it is that people are being held in solitary confinement on the charge of allegedly picketing unlawfully on government property. Like, that is, without exaggeration, on par with how it would go if you were in the gulags in Soviet Russia, because that's how you'd be treated. They would find some little charge of a political dissident, and they would just throw them in prison and leave them there. Obviously, what happened on January 6th was wrong. But what we're starting to find out more and more is that the narrative that we have been fed is complete BS. Obviously, there have been no weapons recovered. The reason the Capitol was evacuated was not because of anything to do with the quote unquote insurrection or riot or protest or whatever adjective you want to use. It was because of the bomb that was located at 1251 at the RNC. And the chief of the former chief of police for the Capitol, I can't remember his exact title, just testified to this to a joint session of the Senate. And it was very clear, it was explicitly clear that that's why it was evacuated. It had nothing to do with the events of, the January 6th protest. we've seen the videos coming out from inside where people are kind of like walking through and they're confused. You got people, taking pictures, staying within the corded ropes. There's a video that came out whenever somebody was trying to get up into Vice President Pence's chair, and another one is yelling at him where he's like, "You've got to be respectful. You've got to that's not ours. You've got to get off it." It was a very weird situation from the videos that I've seen, from, all of the accounts that I've heard. It is definitely a weird situation.
It's so weird because in one part of the building, you'll have the old lady walking around looking like she doesn't know where her dentures are. And then in the other part of the building, you'll have like a line of Oath Keepers systematically like beating the shit out of cops. And this is happening at the exact same time, 250 yards away in space. But they could be in different worlds, how different it is on the footage. And so depending on which news network you're watching, you're going to have completely different opinions of that day.
Right. So the first person who was like actually sentenced over the January 6th was like a hair salon owner. I think it was in late June, and she was convicted, quote unquote, of misdemeanor charges of parading, demonstrating, and picketing on government property. Okay, like if that's what we're charging people with, if that's the convictions we're getting, if that's the scalps we're getting, then it is so disingenuous to keep calling it an insurrection. And that's really where I've started to realize that what we think we might know about this day might turn out to be 100% false. And I say that with complete, I actually believe that, because at first I was like, holy crap, there's a bunch of people up there. They're, it's starting to get violent. It's starting to get pushy. Like, I'm just like kind of watching
literally
this.
There, like, yeah.
Yeah, I was watching it from a distance. I'm like, okay, this kind of looks like a tense situation, right? Okay. And then, on the way back to the hotel, I was watching people get tear gas, and then people coming, back out and pouring milk in their eyes. And I was like, okay, we're just going to leave because there's no reason to be here. It was kind of dumb. So on the way back, we started hearing rumors somebody was shot, the Capitol Police shot somebody inside. Obviously, that would turn out to be Ashley Babbitt later. Didn't know anything at the time. But it didn't feel, when I was there, that anybody was there trying to take over the government. Nobody was talking about it. I didn't hear anything about it. It was clearly not the intent of the crowd. The crowd was there to try and, make their voices heard because they felt like they weren't being heard. And they felt like they were being obfuscated and misconstrued by the press and by the media and by politicians alike. So, and then as you've seen in the 6 months since, how it's been covered, and the routine, it's been routinely debunked. The idea that it's been an insurrection. Oh, it was a violent insurrection. Well, there were no weapons recovered. Oh, well, it was a deadly insurrection. Okay, well, the only person who was killed by a police officer who shot a veteran who was unarmed and was climbing through a window. And we still don't know who shot her. Well, what we do is Michael Byrd, but that hasn't been confirmed. And then AOC comes out and she's saying, oh, well, we were being chased. We had to be evacuated, all of these things. But it turns out the reason she was evacuated wasn't because of the protests. It was because they found a bomb at the RNC. And interestingly enough, basically the only people they haven't caught from January 6th are the people who placed the pipe bombs. They've got the guy who bought a Lego set. They've got the guy who was there taking pictures of the roof. They've got everybody except the guys who actually caused the problem, the guys who actually are responsible for the evacuation of the building, the guys who actually brought a deadly weapon to the premises. They've got all of these political prisoners that, there's over 540 of them now, that they're charging with misdemeanor crimes, calling it an insurrection, and the FBI is completely incompetent whenever it comes to finding the people who actually brought bombs to DC that day. The truth is, I don't really buy the narrative because I think they've shot their credibility to hell. So I'm not giving them the benefit of the doubt because I don't think that they have earned it anymore. I think that they have been proven to have lied about this day and the events of this day enough where for me to continue to give them the benefit of the doubt whenever they still won't release over 14,000 hours of footage, whenever they are still trying to, issue gag orders on the defendants and all of these things to try and keep information from the public, I don't see why that should promote trust with the narrative that you are trying to sell me. Obviously doesn't mean I think that what happened on January 6th was smart, that it was right or anything like that, because I definitely don't. But I think that the events of January 6th pale in comparison to the wrongs that the federal government has committed and is currently committing against the people who were there that day. And I think that's pretty much undeniable.
Yeah, I think my interpretation of that day varies significantly from yours. One thing that has been really good, and I know you're probably not going to believe this one, but the New York Times actually did a great visual investigations. Like they do, their visual investigations team stitched together like probably a couple hundred videos into like this 45-minute documentary that was really, it really helped me understand what was actually happening because they had the 3D map of the Capitol complex, but they also had stitched together so many videos that you felt like you were the first person in the crowd almost throughout the whole of all of the different breaches, which I believe there were 5 or 6 ways that people were getting into the building. So you always felt like you were like the guy leading the charge, just because, so many people were shooting videos on their phone that day that even without a single second of video from the CCTV in the Capitol facility, you can get a very good idea as to what was happening. And like I was talking about earlier, it's absolutely bizarre to watch, like the little door underneath the semicircle, kind of like where the president comes out in the inauguration. I'm not sure what the formal title of that door is, but it was absolute mayhem over there. Whereas there was one of the doors where you walk around the back side of the building where the cops are like taking video with the people walking in. Mm-hmm. That being said, I don't know. I still see like there were parts of that were absolutely brutally violent. Like there's that one video of the cop who's like jammed up in a door that's being shut on him, just like the guy's screaming in pain. It's inhumanly violent. Like it's terrible. You would never do that to another person. It's just like one of the madness of crowds kinds of things. And I think to deny that stuff is serious or say that it's being overblown or that the people that are doing that are being wrongfully held, it's like, if you want to play that game, you're going to face some serious consequences. And I was sitting there watching the TV on January 6th and saying, holy shit, these people are all going to jail for a long time. And I mean, you got to go through person by person and say, what did this person do? Which door did they come through? Who did they knock over? Are you a person who bear sprayed somebody to get in here? Or did you just kind of wander in like that old lady who looked like she didn't know what her middle name is anymore?
Right.
And
she looks like Joe Biden.
Right. Just like Joe Biden. You got to treat all these people appropriately, but saying that it's some sort of false narrative that this was like, at least on some levels, a very gruesomely violent day. While I don't think that they came prepared to overthrow the government, because there's no evidence that they came prepared to overthrow the government. As you point out, no weapons recovered. There were some baseball bats, some bear spray. People did come wearing helmets, especially the Oath Keepers crowd. That New York Times piece does a very good job of pointing out the Oath Keeper guys, because it follows them through the crowd, and you see like they all got their hands on each other's shoulders, and they're all wearing the same military style Kevlar and helmets, and so you think that they might have had some serious intentions. However, then you see the hundreds of other people who are just there and were not like you, who was smart enough to say some shit's going down, I better get out of here. Just people who were 20% too dumb to realize what they were walking into. So it's a very complicated day, but I don't see the benefit in trying to walk back the violence of that day.
No, I'm not at all. Like, if you're beating somebody over the head with a chair, Yeah, no, you should definitely be brought up on assault charges. But the fact that there were maybe 3, 4, 5 instances of really bad, clear assaults that I've seen. I mean, there's a lot of videos that I've seen that are like really confusing as to, you watch it and you're like, I don't know what is happening.
Yeah,
right. But you've got a couple of videos out there where you've got one person or maybe two people that are like actually just like clear on, okay, you're just committing assault. Like, that's just violent assault. Okay, that's what that is. Yeah, no, the 100% they should be charged. But to say that, oh, well, there was a couple of these events spread throughout the Capitol on this day among a crowd of like-minded political, politically similar people, and then we can then kind of imbue that motive or desire for violence or insurrection or whatever to everybody is kind of absurd. And let me put it this way. It is way less than 7% of the people that showed up on January 7th committed assault that day. However, if you look back to all of last year, we were told that 93% of BLM protests were nonviolent, right? And it's well below that number for January 6th. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't be charged for crimes whenever they committed crimes. I'm just saying that you shouldn't be held in solitary confinement for picketing unlawfully on government property or picketing without a permit or parading on government property or interrupting a government hearing. I'm saying that the large majority of people who, like overwhelming majority of people, did not go to DC that day or even to the Capitol, those that went to the Capitol that day, to commit any crimes, to do anything wrong, and the vast majority of them didn't. And if we had any honesty in the media, if we had any honesty in DC, then we would not be blowing this out of proportion. We would treat each person as an individual who went in there. And this is kind of a symptom of, intersectionalism and group identity, where people get judged based on the demographic or their political affiliation or their race or whatever, right? It's kind of just an extension of this group political affiliation that has kind of taken over America recently. If somebody committed a crime that day, they should definitely be charged, but they should be charged appropriately, and that has not been done. And the state has committed way worse violations of civil rights and human rights since January 6th than all of the offenses on January 6th combined. And I think that's pretty clear.
So you just spoke of how the majority of the people who entered the Capitol building on January 6th had no intention of violence and didn't commit any violence when they were there. And I think that in doing so, you kind of spoke to the ability of a very small percentage of people who are capable and willing to commit violence to pull a giant crowd with them into doing the same thing. I think that that's a huge threat to the stability of our democracy and to the republic, because if things continue to get as polarized as they've been in the last couple of years, all it takes is whatever those 2% of people who are willing to escalate things to have people who are too not naive to know that they shouldn't be following them, to follow them over the brink, and all of a sudden we could descend into an absolute lunacy. Obviously speaking vaguely here because of the world that we live in, but you can extrapolate the threats of that propensity that all human beings seem to have to follow the leader in situations like that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of it seems that both the left and the right have had real moves towards authoritarianism lately. The left, obviously, we've seen in the Biden administration clamping down on free speech hard, and the right has clearly developed a cult of personality around Donald Trump. Both of those, to me, as somebody who is first interested in civil liberty and second interested in party politics, seem absolutely terrifying. because both sides can justify their growing authoritarianism by citing the other side's authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you might cite right now how the left's authoritarianism is worse than the right's. And if I was talking to somebody on the left, they would do the inverse. And it's just kind of trying to watch this from an objective perspective. Obviously, I sit in the corner that I sit in, but I try to, when I think about these issues, as I'm developing an opinion, put myself in a neutral perspective, because I think that that's the best way to formulate ideas on these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I see how you could make a very salient point from both sides, and how most people don't think about the other side's perspective. They only see the strongest arguments of their own side and the weakest arguments of the other side,
mm-hmm.
and end up getting, driven into the authoritarian camp that they believe in. What do you make of that?
Well, and I'm sure you know, as far as political science goes, that people tend towards the extremes and always have. That whenever you put a group of people together with the same political ideology, you tend to see that those with the most extreme views within that purview tend to dominate, and then the group tends to kind of migrate towards those extremes. So yes, 100% right that it's an issue. As far as, and I went to one Trump rally with a friend of mine, and I was shocked, in all honesty, by the number of people there that did kind of engage in this weird cult of personality, because I hadn't really run into it before. And in all honesty, it was kind of off-putting, because I didn't like it. It didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. Their support of him had very little to do with, his policy or his positions or anything like that. So I was disappointed by that. But what I've also noticed, and I've seen this with, conversations with people that I've met on campus, and et cetera, is that the opposite is true, because there's a cult of anti-personality, right? That there's such a visceral hatred for Donald Trump that whatever Donald Trump says, the left is going to disagree with, right? So it's really weird, because you can find where probably about 85% of the populace will decide their political position based on what Donald Trump says, right? And that is very bad. Like, the fact that is the case is very bad. And there's a bunch of tweets going around whenever Republicans came out in support of the freedom protests in Cuba, basically supporting them, right? And then the leftists who had originally been supporting them were like, well, whenever fascists start to agree with you, you have to really reconsider your position, right? That means that the reason they're going to change their position has nothing to do with what they believe or the fact pattern, but rather because they don't want to agree with Republicans, right? And that is a terrible, terrible state for a political. You can't have democracy work, or a constitutional republic work, if that's the way people are thinking. If they're putting political ideology and political affiliation above the facts, right? As far as kind of the moves for totalitarianism, I think it's a little bit misleading to compare a cult of personality that a political base has for somebody who doesn't hold political office or any political power versus the move towards authoritarianism, where people are trying to mandate vaccine passports. You're calling for the private reading of text messages. You're working with private companies to censor free speech. And these also are a little bit more damaging because you don't have a term limit on these types of policies, capabilities, or restrictions
of freedom.
Institutionally
supported, and the other is completely extra institutional.
Yes.
Institutionally supported totalitarianism is much more threatening in the long run, because it can just kind of creep its way along until, like the frog in the pot of boiling water. It starts out at an acceptable temperature, and then you have boiled frog.
Yeah, it's been happening, right? It's been happening since the Patriot Act, right? It's not something that is new, right? So it was kind of funny to me whenever people were all up in arms about, oh, the government's going to be reading our text messages. I'm like, no, the government's been reading your text messages. Okay, right. Just so we're clear.
We were probably 12 and 13 when Edward Snowden revealed this to us.
Yes,
and we were probably 1 or 2 when the Patriot Act made this whole thing legal. Which, by the way, thank you, Bush. Thank you, Cheney. Some outstanding Republicans there.
Oh, yeah. Really, true. The faces of conservatism.
Yeah, those guys. And, glad
I
got into all those nice wars.
Oh, yeah. Well, I go back to, it's kind of the same point that they're all friends. You got the picture of Clinton, Bush, and Obama. They're all having fun at the baseball game together. To think of them as conservatives is wrong, just like to think of Obama or Clinton as Democrats is wrong. They're both members of the establishment. They're both members of essentially a uniparty that has really held political power in this country for 40 years. But yeah. As far as the authoritarianism goes, it is an issue. But I do fail to see how they are on equal footing. I hate the cult of personality around Trump. I detest it on a very, even on a visceral level, not to mention, the negative impacts it has for kind of the development of conservatism, because it's kind of put a blocker on, people are like, oh, I'm a conservative and therefore I'm Trump, and Trump is conservatism and conservatism is Trump. And it just loses and dilutes kind of the real draw that conservatism should be, because conservatism shouldn't be reliant on any one person. It shouldn't be emblematic of any one person, but this cult of personality does exist within the Republican Party and within the Trump fan base. I don't think it's the majority,
and it also means that Trump's failings then become the conservative failings. Like Trump's failing on the national debt was absurd, and it's probably the most important thing that he failed on, and nobody called him out for it, because to call him out would be to call the whole conservative movement out, because the conservative movement did not exist outside of Donald Trump.
Right.
The conservatives have now lost their voice to speak out about that issue because of their successive failings in the Bush and Trump administrations. I mean, for my whole life, every single presidency has just been a spending presidency.
Yep.
And it's now reached to the point where the snowball is rolling very fast. But that's largely because there is no room for a Paul Ryan type, who obviously was Mr. Fiscal Conservative. He either had to get on the Trump train and be MAGA, Trump, or get run over by the Trump train, and he chose to get run over by the Trump train. But the fact that there was no air left in the room for these, and say what you will about Paul Ryan on that issue, he was very right and continues to be very right. And Trump is wrong, and doesn't indicate that he's getting any better. And if that's the future of the party on that issue, which to me is very important, we failed. And that's largely because of the Trump cult of personality. That being said, it's a two-edged sword, because without the Trump cult of personality, the feckless conservatives will step right back in, because there will be nothing to hold them to account anymore. So it will be, on the one hand, I don't want Trump to run again, but on the other hand, I want him to remain powerful enough for long enough to keep the uniparty from reemerging, to put the fear of God in the hearts of these conservatives that are going to the ball game with Barack Obama, that there will be a price to pay for that.
Yeah, that's really the $1 million question whenever it comes to the future of conservatism, because we know that the political opportunists will waste no time in jumping back in and seizing the reins of power and going back to the good old days where both right and left establishment types make tons of money, and America continues to lose its war with China. We continue to get buried in debt. Inflation will probably continue to grow, and the American standard of living will slowly be dragged away into the dustbin of history, and who knows where that ends up.
Call Edward Gibbon. It's the decline and fall of the American empire here.
Exactly.
Unless we take active steps to resist that.
Yes.
And while Trump is not very effective in the resistance, at least he voices the importance of that, and maybe can inspire us to elect some people, possibly a Ron DeSantis, who would be forced to come at it from the MAGA America First perspective, but would be able to do so in a way of somebody who's, more emotionally mature than most elementary school students and has experience in government, which could be somebody who actually affects meaningful change. That's kind of the best path that I see for the conservative, really just anti-oligopoly, however you want to put it, anti-uniparty, yes, pro-normal people being able to live their life party.
Right. Which you would think would be really popular, but truth is stranger than fiction.
70 million people voted for Donald Trump for that reason. Unfortunately,
careful what numbers you cite. YouTube might get on you for this.
40 million people voted for Donald Trump.
I think, maybe 5, maybe his immediate family if they could stand him.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation. I really like talking to you because I think you fill a lot of blind spots in the ways that I think about these kinds of issues. You have a very interesting perspective, and maybe we do this again sometime
I'd love to.
Sooner than 6 months.
Yeah, let's do it.